Hello everybody, Mrs. Kip back again with a brand new domain. We finished our domain on animals and their habitats, and today we are starting a new one, fairy tales. I'm excited. So, little introduction to fairy tales. The word tale is another word for story. Many fairy tales, including the one we're going to hear today, were collected a long time ago by two brothers named Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. They're often called the Brothers Grimm, so Grimm's fairy tales. They lived in Germany. Many of the stories that we now know as fairy tales had been told orally for many years in their country and in other countries too. The brothers decided to write the stories down and make a book out of them. Grimm's Fairy Tales. The brothers thought the book would be interesting because the stories are about things that make people happy, sad, and sometimes afraid. Now, more than 200 years later, people are still reading these stories all over the world. Your parents or grandparents probably heard some of these stories when they were young. You may have heard some of these fairy tales before, but some may be completely new to you. The one we're going to read today, I think most of us have heard before. We will be learning what makes fairy tales different from other kinds of stories. We will hear tales that include characters like princesses, princes, giants, witches, and even animals that can talk. Although some of the things that happen in fairy tales could happen in our own lives, many of the things that happen in these stories are fantasy or a kind of make-believe that can't really happen. So, our first story today is Sleeping Beauty, which, like I said, I think a lot of us have heard before, but maybe this will be a little different than the version we have heard. Let's find out. Here's our first picture. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who for many years were very sad because they had no child. At last, a little daughter was born to them, and the king was so happy that he planned a great feast in the palace to which he would invite all of his friends and relatives. A feast is a big, fancy meal. Now, in his country, there were 13 fairies. Of course, the king wished to invite all the fairies to the feast too, so that each might look kindly upon his child and perhaps give the baby a special fairy gift. But as the king had only 12 gold plates for the fairies to eat from, it was decided that one fairy had to be left out. How do you think the fairy's going to feel about being left out from the feast? Not good, right? The feast was held, and what a wonderful celebration it was. As it drew to an end, the fairies came forward to give the child their special gifts. One said to the child, "I give you the gift of virtue, so that you may be good." Another said, "I give you the gift of wisdom, so that you may be wise." A third fairy gave the child the gift of beauty. A fourth gave her riches, and on it went, with each fairy giving everything in the world that one could wish for. "11 of the fairies had given their gifts, and the 12th was just about to speak when suddenly in came the 13th fairy, the one who had been left out. She was very angry, and she cried out in a loud voice, "When the princess is 15 years of age, she shall prick herself with a spindle and die." So to prick yourself means to cut yourself or poke yourself. And a spindle is the pointy part of a spinning wheel. That is a really harsh spell to cast on somebody for not being invited to their party. Without another word, the angry fairy left the hall. Everyone was terrified of what she had said. Then the 12th fairy came forward and said, "I cannot undo the evil spell, but I can soften it. Here then is my gift to the child. The princess shall not die, but she will fall into a deep sleep for 100 years. The king was determined to protect his child. "Surely," he said, "my daughter cannot prick herself with a spindle. if she never sees one. So he gave an order that every spindle in the kingdom should be burned. So why do you think he did that? If there were no spindles left in the kingdom, then there wouldn't be a spindle for her to prick her finger on and fall asleep for 100 years, right? He thought he was getting rid of all of them. The princess grew up, and all the fairies' gifts to the child were plain to see. She was good, she was wise, kind, and beautiful. Everyone who saw her loved her. On the day that she turned 15, the king and queen were away from the palace. The princess was left on her own, and she wandered about the palace, looking into all sorts of places and peeking into rooms that she had never explored before. She climbed a narrow, winding stair that led to a little door with a rusty key sticking out of the lock. She turned the key and opened the door, and there in a little room sat an old woman with a spinning wheel, busily spinning away. And it's her 15th birthday. So what do we think is about to happen? This is the spinning wheel. And that's the spindle. Good day, said the princess, entering the room. What are you doing? She asked, for she had never seen a spinning wheel before. I am spinning, said the old woman. The princess stretched forth her hand and asked, What is this thing that spins around so merrily? But hardly had she spoken when she pricked her finger on the spinning wheel spindle, and in that very moment she fell into a deep sleep. There's everybody sound asleep, even the animals. At the same time, sleep fell upon everyone in the palace. The king and queen, who had just come home and were in the great hall, fell fast asleep. The horses in their stalls, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, and the flies on the wall, all fell asleep. Even the fire in the hearth went out. The wind stopped, and not a leaf fell from the trees. A hearth is the bottom of the fireplace where you put the wood. In time, a hedge of thorns began to grow around the castle, which grew thicker and higher every year, until at last nothing could be seen of the castle, not even the flags on the highest towers. Wow. Here's Sleeping Beauty, fast asleep with all the thorns around her. As the years passed, stories spread throughout the land of a beautiful princess sleeping behind a wall of thorns. Many a young prince came, but none could break through the thorns. But at long last, after many, many years, there came into the country a king's son who heard an old man tell that there was a castle standing behind the hedge of thorns, and there was a beautiful, enchanted princess laying sleeping there. When something's enchanted, it's under a magical spell. The prince said, I shall make my way through and see the lovely princess. The old man warned him that many had tried and failed, but the prince would not listen. He's very brave and determined. For now, the 100 years were at an end, and the day had come for the sleeping princess to be awakened. When the prince drew near the hedge of thorns, it changed into a hedge of beautiful flowers, which bent aside to let him pass. When he reached the castle yard, he saw the horses and dogs lying sleeping, and on the roof the pigeons were sitting with their heads under their wings. As he entered the castle and climbed the steps, the prince saw everyone still asleep. The king, queen, cook, the maids, everyone. All was so quiet, he could hear his own breathing. That's quiet. There he found Sleeping Beauty. At last the prince went up the narrow winding stair and came to the room where the princess was sleeping. When he saw her looking so lovely in her sleep, he could not turn his eyes away. He bent down and kissed her, and she opened her eyes and smiled at him. Together they went down the stairs, and they saw the king and queen waking up, and all the people in the castle waking up and looking at each other in great surprise. The horses in the yard got up and shook themselves. The dogs sprang up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof flew into the fields. The flies on the wall buzzed and crept a little farther. Even the kitchen fire leapt up and blazed. At last the wedding of the prince and princess was held with great feasting and rejoicing. Rejoicing is a time of happiness, a happy celebration. And they lived happily together for the rest of their days. The end. All right, so now we'll go over a few questions and find out what we're going to hear about tomorrow. So, at the beginning of the fairy tale, why did the king and queen have a feast? Remember, a feast is a big fancy meal. Why did the king and queen have a feast? To celebrate the birth of their daughter. Who was invited to the feast? They invited friends, relatives, and only 12 of the 13 fairies, which is what got them into trouble. What were some of the gifts given to the child by the fairies? The fairies gave the gifts of virtue, which is the gift of being good, wisdom, beauty, and riches. Do you think the king made a good decision not to invite the 13th fairy? I think that was a good idea. That was not a good idea because she got really mad and cast the spell on her that she would prick her finger on the spinning wheel and die. So she did not take not getting invited to the feast very well. Why was the 13th fairy so angry? She was angry because she didn't get invited. All because the king didn't have enough gold plates. I'd rather be invited and not get a gold plate than just get left out. I probably wouldn't go as extreme as she did and cast a spell like that, but it would have hurt my feelings. It definitely hurt her feelings. So, how did this fairy tale end? At the end, the prince found Sleeping Beauty. He kissed the enchanted princess. Remember, that meant she had a spell cast on her. On the day that the evil spell ended, and the princess wakes up. Is that a happy ending? Yes, it was a happy ending because they got married and they lived happily ever after. Why do you think this fairy tale is called Sleeping Beauty? Because the beautiful princess gets a spell cast on her and she sleeps for 100 years. What elements of this fairy tale could not happen in real life? What are some things that we heard in this story that could not happen in real life? There's quite a few. Fairies, that couldn't happen in real life. The magic spell, that's not in real life. Sleeping for 100 years and waking up still being a beautiful princess that's not 100 years old, that could not happen in real life. Some things that were different in this version of Sleeping Beauty compared to the one that we've probably seen in the Disney movie Sleeping Beauty. There were only 3 fairies in Sleeping Beauty, and Maleficent is the one that cast the spell on Sleeping Beauty to prick her finger and die. And one of the fairies that hadn't given their gift yet did soften the spell to make it so that she wouldn't die, but she would fall asleep. And it wasn't for 100 years. It was just, you will fall asleep until you get woken by love's first kiss from the prince. Also, in that version of Sleeping Beauty, the Disney version, Sleeping Beauty is the only one that falls asleep. Nobody else falls asleep with her. It's just her. All right, an important vocabulary word that we learned in this story, Sleeping Beauty, was the word wisdom. If someone has wisdom, they have gained knowledge through experience. So they have a lot of knowledge in their noggin from being around for so long. They've seen it all. They've learned a lot. So owls are known as story characters who have great wisdom. I don't really know why that is, but owls are thought to be wise. Have you ever known someone who has shown great wisdom? Do you know anyone that has a lot of knowledge? They're very wise. I mean, you all know me, so, I mean, there's one wise person, you know. But can you think of anybody else that would have a lot of knowledge from experience? They're very wise. They have a lot of wisdom. So your grandparents are probably very wise because they have a lot of experience. Your parents even have a lot of wisdom. Teachers, doctors, they have a lot of knowledge. They know a lot of stuff. They've learned a lot of things, so they're very wise. And that's it for today. Tomorrow, we will be reading Rumpelstiltskin. Some of you might not have heard that story before, but that's the one we will read tomorrow. I can't wait. Have a great night, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.